Hi, and welcome back to the SecurityMetrics podcast. I'm Jen Stone. I'm a principal security analyst here at SecurityMetrics, and I am very excited today to introduce you to Paul Poe. He is going to talk to us about some penetration testing. Paul, would you please tell us about yourself?
Hey, Jen. Thanks very much for having me on the show. Really appreciate that. My name is Paul Poe. I have over 25 years of information security and technology experience. I'm a managing partner here at Radical Security. And what we do here is we are predominantly a offensive security company. So what that means is, in a nutshell, is people pay us to break into companies. Well, their own company, not somebody else.
That's a good clarification. Thank you.
Important clarification. And that's what we do, right? So the kind of work we do is really around things like penetration testing. We do adversarial simulations, red teaming, and then we also provide. It's kind of interesting. A lot of times we end up having to help our customers on the advisory side, usually helping them with understanding sort of what went wrong, what worked, what didn't work. In the industry, some people call it purple teaming. I don't particularly like that term, but it is sort of the marketing genre these days. I got into this. I got into security um, really a long time ago. I was back in the old days when the internet was very young. Um, I was a systems programmer, right? Back then, when you buy a computer, you don't just go to Best Buy to buy software. You either wrote it or you ported it. And I worked for Tufts University at the time, and they had just bought a brand new, spanking new supercomputer for something like $7 to $8 million.
Mm.
And I was brought on to basically write software for that computer. And my first experience with security back when I was, sort of a wee software engineer was one day we started noticing that all our computers across campus started slowing down. A lot of them did. And essentially, we were um, one of the victims of one of the very first worms out there, the Morris worm. If
Oh,
you're
wow.
familiar with internet
Yeah.
history, you might remember that this was a piece of software that went and attacked mail software gateways. Um, Back then, right, the notion of security was not really there, right, because the only computers on the internet were either government computers or academic computers.
Sure.
And this worm actually took advantage of debugging that was turned on in most mail systems, uh, and effectively created a fork bomb, right? And it was a lot of people say it was really just a bug in the worm, but it caused a lot of our systems to sort of go down,
Mhm.
and that was kind of when how I got interested in cybersecurity sort of back then.
Interesting. So, I think I've mentioned this on the podcast before. You have a very similar background to what my father did, and I remember the Morris worm because he was so angry about it, and he was all, "This is going to ruin the internet for." Well, I don't think we even called it the internet back then, but this is going to ruin things for everybody. Right? He was really upset that people were taking advantage of the system because it hadn't been built with security in mind. It was built with collaboration in mind, and this is something we are doing together, like you said, in the academic world and in government agencies. So that's an interesting bit of history there. If people haven't heard of the Morris worm, that's something fun to look up.
Yes. And that's kind of how I got interested in it. My initial introduction was really doing what we call blue team work, right? Usually cyber defense. I did a lot of software engineering work around sort of making sure that software is safe. I worked in financial services for a long time, and when we started Radical Security, my business partner is an active security researcher doing only offensive security. So it worked really well for us in what we do, and it's a lot of fun, right? It's a
Yeah.
lot of fun to kind of find the problems that sometimes organizations kind of forget about.
Hmm.
They're sort of the obvious ones. Even companies that have really good security, a lot of times it's it's like the little thing that they forget about that causes the problem. And
Right.
our job is to kind of find that little thing right before
Nice.
somebody else does.
So maybe help me. A lot of our listeners are either newer to cybersecurity or smaller organizations, and looking for an understanding of some of these topics. So maybe let's start by stepping back a little bit and helping people understand maybe what a penetration test is, the different types. Can you speak to that just a little bit?
Yeah. I mean, at a very high level, a penetration test is it's a test of your security posture, right? It's a group of specialists ourselves who focus only on how to break into your organization, right? That's all we do. We do a lot of research around that. We hone a lot of tools and tech. We build a lot of our own tools, including the ones that are out there, and we build a lot of tactics and techniques to sort of breach your perimeter. As far as the different kinds, at a very high level, we think of pen testing as either black box testing, white box testing, or gray box testing. So a black box test is a test where we might come in, not know anything about your organization, other than that you exist, and we try to break in, right? A white box test, on the other hand, is something where we know everything about your organization, right? You give us, names of all your employees. We may have access to a source code, and the goal is to now kind of use that information and find all the inherent flaws that are out there and try to break into your organization, right? A gray box test is something in between. That's probably the most common kind, right? And the reason why is it simulates what probably will happen in real life, right? The reason why gray box test is very effective is, right, we know enough about your information, about your business, where that we would figure out anyway, right? Like, it's easy to figure out who works at a company. It's easy to
Sure.
figure out what tech stack they're using. It's easy enough to fingerprint, devices. So we sort of get all that information in advance when we conduct the attack, right?
Hmm.
Now, that's sort of like at a very high level, sort of those three things. The other thing is there are different ways to actually conduct the penetration test. I mentioned red teaming. I mentioned adversarial simulations. Now, probably 10, 15 years ago, what we call red teaming today, or even adversarial simulations, are really kind of what real pen testing is. There are a lot of organizations that call penetration testing, really what is a vulnerability assessment, right? Where they're just
Hmm.
sort of running tools, and then sort of spitting out a report. That's really
Right.
not pen testing,
Right.
right? So a penetration test is when you have somebody that actually understands how to use tools and techniques to actually try to break in and exploit a vulnerability that they find. It's not just discovering the vulnerability; it's
Hmm.
understanding whether if that vulnerability is real and whether it can result in some impact to an organization. Um, red teaming is when we tend to where the goal of a red team is very different than the goal of a pen test, right? So a penetration test tends to be very broad, right? The idea is to cover everything within the organization and test the entire attack surface of their organization. When we conduct a red team, or even an adversarial simulation, we are more goal based, meaning that we have worked out with a client some important piece of information or some important asset within the organization
Hmm.
that we're going to go after,
Right.
whether it's the source code, whether it's being able to reach some application, um, and we have a very broad scope where we're allowed to use whatever tools and tactics that we are familiar with, or that are work for us. Anything from social engineering to attacking maybe an employee's home network,
Hmm.
to using custom exploits. So
Right.
it's a very different kind of attack.
So, given that there are different types of attacks that you can do, what what makes an organization choose one type of test over another?
Sure. A lot of times, what motivates an organization is sort of the data they have to protect, right? Or their reputation in some cases.
Sure.
Right. If you're a regulated organization, meaning that you have, data that is, such as financial information or transactions, or you process healthcare records. Um, you may be required to conduct sort of a compliance-based penetration test where it's very broad. You cover everything,
Mhm.
but that doesn't mean you don't do other kinds of penetration testing as well, or even red teaming. But
Sure.
minimally, you have to do that.
Right, we see that a lot in, like, the PCI world, where it's very clear you have to do a vulnerability scan by a specific type of vulnerability scan provider if you take so many credit cards, and then after that, you have to also do penetration testing, right? So it's very defined, and it is only about a very specific thing. And so I think some of the people who are interested in this might think of it that way, what regulations they fall under, but also, how you described it, the value is a real hacker isn't going to care about whether you have just PAN, just credit card data and just go after that. Scoping minimally, I think, probably leaves a lot of groups more exposed than they realize.
Yes, and that's kind of interesting you said that, right? We actually have a few clients where we are one of, perhaps several penetration test teams that they engage with. We tend to be, highly boutique. We tend to focus on actually breaching the organization.
Right.
So for a lot of our clients, they will use a penetration test firm that maybe does. I'm not trying to disparage them, but because I think there's value in kind of
Sure,
doing that
sure, but it's a
broad
different
compliance
type of
cookie
value, it's a
cutter
different
base.
type of
Yeah,
focus. Yeah,
right. Because their focus is to do broadly, make sure all the low hanging fruit's done.
sure.
So they will have so our clients will use those firms to create those penetration test reports that they can share with an auditor or share with a
Mhm.
customer,
Sure.
and then they will engage with us to kind of do the penetration test that they don't really share with anyone else,
Right.
right? In some cases, we are actually engaged through legal counsel, right?
Mhm,
So that our work is considered attorney work product.
mhm.
So that our reports basically cannot be subpoenaed for example, or they
Right.
consider it attorney-client privilege.
Sure,
So
sure. So, regardless of what test, a group decides to or series of tests they decide to go with, is there preparation that, a company needs to do in order t to start a pen test?
so you know my feeling is that if you have to prepare for a pen test, you're probably not running your security program properly, right? Because you should always
Yep.
be at that state where you're ready to be attacked, right? Because
Sure.
the malicious actor is not going to sort of, be sending you a statement say they are going to attack and that this is the scope, right? If you're not always ready for that, um, then you're not doing it right. So, our conversation when we talk to a client to conduct a penetration test is that we're going to agree on a date, right? So the only preparation is sort of knowing, that we're not going to, maybe do a pen test, say when it's your high season, for example, right? Or
Sure. Yeah.
when you're, maybe doing like your annual company conference, right? So that we are not disruptive to your staff.
Yeah.
Um, as far as other preparations, if we're testing, say, web applications, it's usually good to kind of make sure you have your staging environment or your pre-production environment, the one that we're going to use to test an application, ready, and that
Mhm.
it's sort of as close to your production as possible, right? some certain kinds of testing you don't want to necessarily do against your production environment. You might want
Right.
to do it against your pre-production environment or your test development environment
Right.
instead. That's really the only kind of preparation I would say is required.
Right. There's also like the timeline in relationship to timing. There's different types of tests. We've already kind of mentioned some of them. There's the web app test. So if you're testing an application that is available to the internet, that's a different type of test than, for example, a network layer penetration test, which again is different from starting with the physical and trying to get in, that way. So what are the different timelines for the different types of tests? Are there similarities or the differences?
You mean like, should web applications be tested first versus network
Yeah,
applications?
yeah,
I'm sorry, or network services. Um, I think different test teams and organizations will or pen test companies will have like preferences. We actually don't. I don't personally believe that it should ever matter. Right. To my original point about like you are never going to predict when a malicious actor is going to be attacking your network or your
right.
web application. Um, I think the only time you want to think about timeline is sort of you know like don't ask us to test your web application if a week before you're going to be rolling out some new enhancements. That then there's not much value in doing that, right?
Right,
We rather wait for you to make those important enhancements that we will test, as opposed to like having you actually like have something that is gonna not be used, in a couple weeks,
right.
right? So that kind of scheduling is kind of important. And then the other timing that's important is it's usually better for us to do the testing sort of before you go into production, um,
Yes.
especially a big launch, right? Because it's a lot cheaper and it's to fix a problem before it's in production,
Hmm.
and it's a lot well, it's a lot safer, right?
Yeah.
Earlier this year, we were engaged with one of our clients, and they they were about to launch a big product. It was going to be a global launch, and they had a lot of press and marketing lined up. And luckily, they engaged with us, before they launched.
Hmm.
We started doing the pen test about a month before they, was scheduled for launching. Um, about 2 weeks before or 3 weeks before the launch, and this was a very clean application, but we did find sort of like two areas where we were able to actually extract basically their user tables, right? So
Mm,
we can extract usernames,
sure.
passwords, or password hashes.
Hmm.
Um, and we were able to determine the kind of hash type, and we were actually able to crack a couple of those,
Right.
right? So we halted the pen test, to so that they could actually fix that problem before they launch.
Nice.
If they had launched with that, that was a probability that they would have had some serious problems.
And that just shows you the value of having a third party look at it because probably the people on their team had every intent of doing good security. They were, hey, our passwords are hashed. We should be good because they didn't know that you can reverse hashes.
So in this particular case, um, what actually happened was they had very good input sanitization, right? They actually had a design pattern that was used everywhere
Mhm.
except for in two places. Those
Oh,
are the two places we found, right? Because they were sort of pushing things out that
mhm.
I think they brought in a new engineer that didn't sort of follow a standard or something like that.
Right.
And to your point, like a lot of people not realizing, things like being able to crack hashes and do things like password reuse.
Sure.
It's a lot of times it's education.
Because, yeah, even good security guys, not everybody can know everything, and especially if you're new. I think that shows also the value of following the standard procedures for an organization because that way, if you have a problem with one thing, you can fix all the things based on what your procedures are rather than, and I know people go, oh, standards and procedures are so boring. But there's a lot of security value in doing things the same way in each for each person and each group.
Yep. And and that's so true too, right? I mean, I'll give you an example. This was an organization, a media company, um, really sharp development team. Um, you know, had had very had really good DevOps teams as well, right? They engaged us to do a penetration test, probably like 2 years ago or something like that.
Mhm.
Um, Very clean application. We couldn't find really any problems. The infrastructure was very locked down, very well. Nothing significant at all. So for us, it was kind of a I guess boring penetration test.
Right.
So sometimes we'll ask hey looks pretty clean. We have some extra time. Are we allowed to do X Y Z?
Oh, uh-huh.
Right. So we asked, we kind of had a suspicion about where they might have a weakness,
Mhm.
right? And it was in sort of user education,
Uh-huh.
right? And so we asked if we could attack their source code, and they said yes. So we basically were able to integrate all the employees in the company that we thought had access to source code, and eventually, use some password reuse attacks to gain access to their code base.
Mhm.
So we showed that. So what we were able to demonstrate is, yeah, software development and engineering is great. Their DevOps is great. But a malicious actor could just attack your source code and insert. Basically, we showed that we could actually insert a backdoor that could have gotten pushed into production.
Right.
Right. So it's security really is about not just one aspect of it's not just always just protecting production, right? Because
Sure.
if we can get it through a back door, um, you know, we will.
Right? There's many avenues in, and that's what defense in depth is all about.
Right.
Can't just protect one thing. You need to protect one thing in many different ways.
I think that's the thing that I think we always try to tell our clients, right?
Right.
It's not just that one area you have to think about.
So you mentioned you're very boutique firm. You do some very specific things. There are other pen testing organizations that do a broad range of services. And as with any industry, there are some really great pen test firms, and there are some that are a little sketchy. But a lot of organizations aren't going to know how to tell the difference, and so often they'll go with the lowest price. Right? Because have to get a pen test. Let's go with the lowest price. So that's a bad way to choose. But what's a good way to choose a penetration testing company?
I mean, the reality is that most pen test companies like ourselves, we don't do any advertising, and we don't really do any direct selling, and one of the reasons is because I think good pen test firms get a lot of business by word of mouth.
Mhm.
So a good way to kind of you know, understand who you might want to use as a pen test firm is, talk to your auditor, talk to your peers, right? Most of we tend to work with usually with CTOs, VP of engineerings,
Mm.
and that's usually where we get out, a lot of our referrals, right?
Sure,
If you're a VP of engineering, if you're a CISO, if you're a CTO, you know, you probably have friends, and colleagues in other businesses. I ask them. Like
sure.
in my mind, that's usually the best way to kind of um, get a lot of these sort of very specialty services, right?
Right,
Now, if you are just needing very compliance type testing, well, most there's a high probability your VAR that you are buying, maybe security software from, they might actually have a pen test business. Most times, it's actually some other company, right?
right.
You know, which might be a good way to do it too.
Nice.
Um, it all kind of it. I think to your point, it all kind of depends. Now, the one thing I think I would agree is you do kind of get what you pay for,
Mhm.
right? A lot of the pen test companies that do sort of a very low cost or uh, sort of service, it's usually because they're just sort of running, scanners, right, and then just kind of going through the results,
Right.
or perhaps they have you know pen testers that don't really have a lot of experience yet.
Sure.
Um, the reality is that penetration testers who are very good are usually in very high demand.
Uh-huh.
And the reason for it is, um, you know, the skill set's very it's very specific, right? You have to really like to be a pen tester, and not everybody
Right.
likes enjoys it.
Yeah. Well, so what makes a really good pen tester?
I think they have to be very creative, right? They have to think like they have to think outside the box.
Mhm.
A lot of times it starts with that versus sort of some technical skill set, right? It's that mentality of, you know, I'm going to steal something. How am I going to go about doing that?
Yeah. And they get pretty charged up about it. I was so I when I started at SecurityMetrics, they didn't have any extra space left on the auditor floor, so I got to sit with the pen testers, which has been fantastic. I love it, but they're very very quiet usually. So I came to work one day and walked through the pen test area, and all of a sudden one of the guys went, "I got a bus," and I thought, "Are you playing video games here at work?" So I stopped. I was like, What did you win?" And he's like, "Well, I'm doing this pen test, and I got the CEO's box." Like it was legitimately the most charged up I had ever seen him, winning that target that he had tried to go after and actually making it. So that kind of level of it matters to them whether they reach their target or not is that's pretty cool. I don't know if you've seen that kind of.
Yeah, I mean it's definitely it's almost like a game, right?
Mhm,
I think that's what kind of it's that's the kind of mentality of somebody that makes a good pen tester. Um, Reality also is that I do come across sort of high burnout, right?
mhm,
There are some pen testers that are sometimes so good, and if they're in a firm where they're maybe pen testing a lot and always finding the same problems, they sort of get frustrated. And then to kind of elaborate on the question, I do think from a skill set perspective, um, different people have different biases around that, right?
mhm,
So, um, for us, we like to work with pen testers that have software engineering backgrounds that actually know how to write code.
mhm,
Um, and the reason for that is we do a lot of custom type work, meaning
mhm,
that, if we're attacking, say, software, right? Because our clients tend to be usually technology companies.
mhm,
Um, we may need to sort of write custom tools or exploits to sort of breach that organization. We also have this mindset that um, you know s- somebody with a software engineering background that can write code or can at least understand code, um, have a better sense of sort of where people make mistakes, right?
mm,
Because a lot of times they may have made them before in the past, right?
sure.
Me, I mean, I'll be the first to admit that I've written some software that has had some serious bugs in it, right? And that happens,
Uh-huh,
early in your career. That's usually what happens.
mhm,
Uh, so having that empathy, right, with the people they are talking, I think is important. That's not to say that people that come from like a pure sort of network engineering or even IT background can't be pen testers.
mhm.
Um, I think that's just our preference. So.
So, kind of moving on to working with customers, um, I'm interested in perception. A lot of times when we're working with customers, what they think is reality and what is actually reality often is not the same thing. So, from in terms of and I don't know, maybe you see the same thing or not, but what organizations are afraid of in terms of threats, as opposed to what you find are the actual threats or vulnerabilities that they're dealing with. What do you see in that area?
Um, well, definitely, at least with our client base, we see a lot of them sort of doubling down on things like, cloud security and application security, right? Sort of protecting the core production, um, sort of systems. Lots of training. Um, you know, spending a lot of money on things like, CDNs for DDoS mitigation, or web application firewalls, honeypots, that sort of thing. Um, and I think that's a good thing, right? And on the application security side, we're definitely seeing um, companies spending dollars and tools on things like static code analyzers, running bug bounties. I mean, these are all good things to do. Now, where we see people kind of forgetting is they are so focused on sort of technology and tooling that they're sometimes forgetting about some of the soft things, right? Like social engineering training,
Sure.
um, you know, making sure people follow process, right, that they have set down,
Hmm.
or securing endpoints, right?
Yeah.
Because everything's in the cloud, so I think they just need to secure that cloud. Um, I mean, I'll give you an example. We were conducting a pen test, um, I think in this, a few months ago.
Hmm.
And that's going fine. A few kind of routine kind of problems like XSS, but we sort of strayed outside the scope because it's a client that we do a lot of work for, and um, we we sometimes will, if we're permitted, will sort of go sort of look elsewhere. Um, and we were enumerating sort of some of their domains, basically trying to find out, do they have uh, systems and assets that maybe they kind of forgot about, right? Or the security team didn't tell us about. And we found a website that the marketing department was building
Oh
for
no.
some for basically for a conference. Um, and some of the processes weren't being followed, and we were able to sort of break into and basically take it over, right?
Sure.
Yeah, so the point I was trying to make is like, I think sometimes companies forget that, well, okay, it's marketing, it's meant to be public.
Right.
Um, so what does it really matter? It doesn't really touch production. But the problem was that that marketing website had a, log into your account button on there. So we
Mm.
could have replaced it, redirected them to say a proxy, right?
Yeah.
Basically introduce a man in the middle attack
Sure.
where we can now start harvesting credentials of their customers going into their production systems,
Right.
right? So, you know, it's not just because it's sort of a sort of unrelated public site, doesn't mean that it's not important or there isn't an attack vector.
Right. And I like that your point that i- if you limit your pen testing company and say, I only want this narrow thing tested, you're leaving yourself wide open. So allowing that broader look into your systems is important. There was also a term that you used. We use it all the time, XXS. It's cross-site scripting, and it's like we use it as a throwaway term because we see it all the time. So maybe just briefly mention what that is.
And by the way, the thing I want to point out about some of these vulnerabilities is, you know, it, I think what differentiates a good pen test company from, or a good pen test team from, one that's just routinely just kind of throwing things out is like, yeah, cross-site scripting is an OWASP top 10, or at least maybe they used to be.
It still is.
Not
Yep.
all, yeah, not all vulnerabilities are like critical just because it's on that list or it's
Yeah.
high, right?
Yep.
We actually will spend time kind of seeing, well, is there really a way to kind of use that vulnerability to attack the application or
Right.
the organization, right?
Yeah.
We have found sort of exercises that we will say, well, it's really not a high because it's kind of a weird edge condition and
Hmm.
there's really nothing you can do with it, for example. But
Right.
we'll point it out anyway.
Yeah. Oh, for sure. And I'm glad that you mentioned that. As an assessor, I will often be asked those questions, and if you want to be pedantic in your approach, you say no. Every cross-site scripting instance has to be wiped out. But honestly, if the security can't be violated from just because it's on OWASP top 10, are we really going to spend time or make people spend money fixing a thing, right? So having that broad understanding of security and what the kill chain really looks like in some of these cases is of benefit to a customer. So, well, this has been awesome. Thank you so much for coming and talking to us. I would love to have you back again in the future. If people want to learn more about you or your the company that you work for, any events coming up, where can they go?
Well, the easiest way is our website, right? It's radicalsecurity.io. Um, and we welcome anyone that ever wants that just wants to talk about security. I actually like just talking to people about their
Sure.
challenges, even if they're not a client, because I find sort of the way people attack security problems interesting.
Yes, as do I. Yeah.
Yeah, and a lot of times by having that dialogue, because for me, I might learn something new or interesting just from that conversation.
Very good. Thank you so much, and we'll make sure and put the link to your company in the show notes, and have you on again. Thanks, Paul.
Thanks, Jen. I appreciate it.
Bye bye. Thanks for joining us again this week. I hope you enjoyed listening to Paul Poe of Radical Security as much as I did. Again, you can check out in the show notes. There's a link to his company, and hopefully see you again next time. Thanks for watching. To watch more episodes of Security Metrics podcast, click on the box on the left. If you prefer to listen to this podcast, it's available on all your favorite podcast platforms. See you on the slopes.